The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Capitol building as Senator John Kennedy made his way through the familiar corridors. His cowboy boots clicked against the polished stone, echoing the same rhythm they had for years. But today felt different. His usual easy smile was there, greeting the staff and security guards he passed, yet something behind his eyes had changed. Kennedy's chief of staff walked beside him, clutching a thick folder and speaking in hushed tones. "Senator, are you absolutely sure about this approach? It's quite a departure from your usual style." Kennedy just nodded, his Louisiana drawl seeming lighter than usual as he replied, "Sometimes you got to change up the playbook if you want different results." 3 blocks away, Representative Jasmine Crockett was putting the finishing touches on her debate preparation. She sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of papers, charts, and policy briefs. Her team buzzed around her like worker bees, each one feeding her last-minute statistics and talking points about infrastructure spending, job creation numbers, and economic impact studies. "Remember, Congresswoman," her communications director said, "Kennedy's going to come at you with those folksy stories and try to make you look like you're overthinking things. Just stick to the facts and don't let him drag you into his country wisdom routine." Crockett laughed confidently, tapping her pen against the desk. "Trust me, I've dealt with his type before. All charm, no substance. The numbers don't lie, and I've got plenty of them." She had every reason to be confident. Over the past 2 years, Crockett had built a reputation as one of the sharpest policy minds in Congress. Her ability to break down complex legislation into understandable pieces had made her a favorite on news shows and political panels. She could quote statistics from memory, connect seemingly unrelated policy dots, and deliver devastating critiques of her opponent's positions with surgical precision. Meanwhile, Kennedy was reviewing his own materials, but they looked nothing like what his staff expected. Instead of the usual collection of homespun analogies and simplified talking points, his desk was covered with detailed research reports, voting records, and transcripts of Crockett's previous appearances. He had sticky notes marking specific quotes, highlighted passages that revealed contradictions, and a timeline that traced her policy evolution over the past 18 months. His longtime aide watched nervously as Kennedy studied these documents with an intensity she had rarely seen. "Senator, I have to ask, where did all this research come from? This isn't like your usual preparation." Kennedy looked up, and for a moment, his carefully crafted persona seemed to slip. His eyes were sharp, calculating, focused in a way that would have surprised anyone who only knew his public image. "Well now," he said, the drawl returning but somehow feeling more deliberate, "sometimes folks underestimate what you're capable of when you let them think they got you all figured out." He closed the folder and stood up, straightening his tie. "Been playing the country boy for so long I almost forgot I went to law school too." The television studio was buzzing with pre-show energy when both politicians arrived. The production crew moved around them, adjusting lights, testing microphones, and briefing them on the segment timeline. The host, a veteran political journalist, was reviewing her notes and preparing for what she expected to be another typical Capitol Hill debate. Lots of talking points, some memorable sound bites, and the usual partisan back and forth that audiences had come to expect. Kennedy settled into his chair with his characteristic easy manner, nodding to the camera crew and making small talk about the weather. He complimented the makeup artist on her work and asked the sound technician about his weekend fishing trip. To everyone watching, he was the same affable senator they had seen dozens of times before, relaxed, friendly, and seemingly unprepared for the intellectual combat that was about to unfold. Crockett arrived with her usual confidence, her heels clicking decisively against the studio floor. She reviewed her notes one final time, mentally organizing her key statistics and preparing her responses to Kennedy's predictable approach. She had watched tapes of his previous appearances, studied his debate style, and felt completely prepared for what was coming. In her mind, this would be another opportunity to showcase the difference between style and substance, between political theater and serious policy work. The makeup team worked on both politicians, and during this time they made polite conversation. Kennedy asked Crockett about her recent committee work, and she responded with genuine enthusiasm about an infrastructure bill she had been developing. As she talked, Kennedy listened with what seemed like his typical courteous attention, nodding and making appropriate comments. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that his questions were more specific than usual, probing deeper into the details of her proposals. "That's mighty interesting," Kennedy said as she explained her funding mechanism. "So you're saying the federal matching requirements would incentivize state participation?" It was the kind of technical question that might have surprised people who only knew him from his more theatrical moments in committee hearings. As the final minutes before going live ticked away, both politicians went through their mental preparations. Crockett reviewed her key statistics one more time, confident that her command of the facts would carry the day. She had built her career on being the smartest person in the room, and she saw no reason why today would be different. Kennedy, meanwhile, seemed to be doing something unusual. Instead of the last-minute cramming or nervous energy that most politicians displayed before a big debate, he appeared to be centering himself, almost like an athlete preparing for competition. His breathing was steady, his posture relaxed but alert, and his eyes held a focus that his staff had never seen before. The studio lights came up to full brightness, and the host received her cue from the control room. "Good morning, and welcome to Capitol Hill Live. I'm here with Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana and Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas to discuss the infrastructure spending bill currently making its way through Congress." She turned to her guests with a professional smile. "This promises to be an illuminating discussion about one of the most important policy debates of our time." As the red recording light flickered on, signaling they were now broadcasting live to millions of viewers across the country, both politicians straightened in their chairs. Crockett felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with live television. Her mind sharp and ready to deploy the arsenal of facts and figures she had prepared, she was ready to dismantle whatever folksy wisdom Kennedy might try to deploy against her carefully researched positions. Kennedy, for his part, felt something different than his usual pre-debate nerves. There was a calm certainty about him, the feeling of a chess player who had been thinking several moves ahead, while his opponent was still focused on the current position. He had spent months watching, listening, and learning. Today, the people who thought they knew Senator John Kennedy were about to discover they had been watching only one side of a much more complex political mind. The cameras rolled, the host began her introduction, and what was supposed to be a routine political debate was about to become something entirely unexpected. The host's voice filled the studio as she began the debate. "Let's start with the basics. Representative Crockett, you've been a strong advocate for increased infrastructure spending. Can you tell us why you believe this investment is necessary right now?" Crockett leaned forward slightly, her confidence evident as she launched into her prepared response. "Absolutely. The numbers are crystal clear on this issue. Our infrastructure is crumbling, and every day we delay action costs us more money and puts American lives at risk. We're talking about bridges that haven't been properly maintained in decades, water systems that are failing our communities, and roads that are literally falling apart under our feet." She continued with the passion that had made her a rising star in Congress. "The American Society of Civil Engineers gave our infrastructure a grade of C-. That's not acceptable for the world's leading economy. We need to invest $2.6 trillion over the next decade just to bring our infrastructure up to acceptable standards." The host nodded and turned to Kennedy, expecting his usual folksy response about government spending and fiscal responsibility. Everyone in the studio was prepared for the familiar dance. Crockett with her facts and figures, Kennedy with his down-home wisdom about taxpayer money and government overreach. But something strange happened. Kennedy didn't lean back in his chair with that easy smile. He didn't start with "well now" or "let me tell you something." Instead, he sat forward, his eyes focused directly on Crockett, and said something that caught everyone off guard. "You know what, Representative Crockett? You're absolutely right about those numbers." The studio fell silent for a moment. Even the camera operators seemed surprised. This wasn't the script anyone expected. Kennedy continued, his voice clearer and more direct than anyone had heard before. "The infrastructure crisis is real, And your statistics are accurate. The $2.6 trillion figure comes from the latest ASSE report, and frankly, it might even be conservative. What I find interesting, though, is how your proposed solutions have evolved over the past year. Crockett blinked, momentarily thrown off by this unexpected agreement. She had prepared for opposition, not collaboration. Well, yes, policies do evolve as we gather more information and feedback from constituents. They certainly do, Kennedy replied, and now his tone had shifted into something sharper. For instance, 18 months ago during the transportation committee hearings, you argued quite passionately that federal infrastructure spending should prioritize rural areas that have been historically underserved. You said, and I'm quoting here, "We cannot continue to ignore the communities that have been left behind by decades of urban-focused investment." He reached into his folder and pulled out a document. "But your current bill allocates 68% of funding to metropolitan areas with populations over 500,000. That's quite a change from your previous position about rural communities being left behind." The host's eyebrows raised. This level of detailed preparation was not what anyone expected from Kennedy. Crockett's confident expression began to shift as she realized this wasn't going to be the debate she had prepared for. "Senator Kennedy," she replied, trying to regain her footing. "Policy positions naturally evolve as we get better data and understand the complexities of implementation. The metropolitan areas have the highest concentration of failing infrastructure and the greatest economic impact." Kennedy nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes never left hers. "That's a reasonable explanation, but it's curious timing considering that your largest campaign contributors over the past year have been construction companies and engineering firms based primarily in those same metropolitan areas. According to the FEC filings, these donors contributed over $800,000 to your re-election campaign." The studio atmosphere shifted dramatically. The host sat up straighter, sensing that this debate had just taken an unexpected turn. The camera crew exchanged glances, realizing they might be witnessing something more significant than a routine political discussion. Crockett's face tightened. "Senator, if you're implying that my policy positions are influenced by campaign contributions, that's completely false and frankly insulting. I make decisions based on data, constituent needs, and what's best for the American people." "Oh, I'm not implying anything," Kennedy said, his Louisiana accent noticeably lighter now. "I'm just noting some interesting patterns. For example, your passionate advocacy for green infrastructure requirements. Very admirable, very forward-thinking. Except that these requirements favor specific types of construction materials and techniques that just happen to be specialties of 3 companies that have collectively given your campaign over $400,000. He pulled out another document. "Here's your speech from 6 months ago where you said traditional concrete and steel infrastructure projects were outdated approaches that ignore environmental realities. But funny thing, just 2 years ago you voted against a green infrastructure amendment because you said it would unnecessarily burden contractors with experimental requirements." The transformation was remarkable. The man sitting across from Crockett bore little resemblance to the folksy senator everyone thought they knew. His words were precise, his research thorough, and his delivery surgical in its effectiveness. Crockett tried to maintain her composure, but her voice had an edge to it now. "Senator, this is exactly the kind of political gotcha game that Americans are tired of. Instead of discussing the real issues facing our infrastructure, you're cherry-picking quotes and implying corruption where none exists." Kennedy's response was delivered with an almost clinical detachment. "Representative, I'm not cherry-picking anything, I'm looking at patterns. Your voting record, your public statements, your campaign finance reports, and your current legislative priorities. When you put them all together, they tell a story that's quite different from the one you're presenting to the American people today." He leaned back slightly, and for the first time since the debate began, something resembling his old smile appeared. But it wasn't the warm, folksy grin people were used to. This smile had an edge to it, the look of someone who had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. "You see, folks have been underestimating what happens when you actually read all those reports and documents that cross your desk. Most people just assume that because someone talks slow and tells stories about fishing, they must not be paying attention to the details. But sometimes the best way to learn what people really believe is to let them think you're not smart enough to understand what they're really saying. The host finally found her voice. Senator Kennedy, this is quite a departure from your usual debate style. What prompted this level of detailed preparation? Kennedy looked directly at the camera, and his voice carried a weight that none of his usual performances had ever conveyed. Well, ma'am, sometimes you reach a point where you realize that being underestimated might have been useful for a while, but it's not serving the people who sent you here anymore. The American people deserve representatives who do their homework, who ask the hard questions, and who aren't afraid to point out when the emperor has no clothes. Crockett's hands were clenched in her lap now, her earlier confidence completely gone. She had walked into what she thought would be a routine policy debate and found herself in the middle of a methodical dismantling of her political credibility. The man she had dismissed as all style and no substance was proving to have been paying much closer attention than anyone had imagined. The silence in the studio stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Crockett's media training kicked in as she tried to regain control of the situation. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the camera, attempting to redirect the conversation back to familiar territory. What Senator Kennedy is doing right now is exactly what's wrong with Washington, she said, her voice carrying a forced steadiness. Instead of talking about real solutions for real problems, he's playing political games and making personal attacks. The American people don't care about campaign finance conspiracy theories. They care about whether their bridges are safe to drive on. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He opened his folder again, and this time he pulled out what looked like a printed social media post. You're absolutely right that people care about bridge safety, Representative. That's why I found your Twitter post from last Tuesday so interesting. You wrote, and I quote, "Just drove across the Henderson Bridge in my district. This is exactly why we need infrastructure investment now. Unacceptable conditions for American families." He looked up from the paper. Now that's a powerful message. Very relatable, very urgent. Except there's one small problem. He reached for another document. According to the Texas Department of Transportation inspection report from 3 months ago, the Henderson Bridge received a rating of good condition with only minor maintenance recommended. In fact, it was completely resurfaced just 18 months ago using federal highway funds. The host's eyes widened. This level of fact-checking in real time was unprecedented in her experience. Representative Crockett, do you have a response to that? Crockett's face flushed slightly. I may have been referring to a different bridge, or perhaps there were conditions that weren't reflected in that particular report. The broader point remains valid. Our infrastructure needs attention. Kennedy's voice remained calm, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath it now. Well, that's certainly possible. Memory can be tricky. Let me help refresh yours. He pulled out another sheet of paper. Here's your Facebook post from 6 weeks ago, where you shared a photo of what you called crumbling infrastructure in my district that Washington ignores. The photo showed a pothole-filled road with the caption, "This is what neglect looks like." He paused, letting the anticipation build. Curious thing about that photo, though. A reverse image search shows it was originally posted by a city council member in Detroit 3 years ago. Same photo, same potholes, just different captions. The studio crew had stopped pretending to work. Even the camera operators were focused on the unfolding drama. This wasn't just a political debate anymore. It was becoming a public examination of truth in politics. Crockett's composure was starting to crack. Senator, I don't know what game you're playing here, but if you're accusing me of deliberately misleading people, that's a serious allegation. Sometimes staff members make mistakes with social media posts. Oh, I'm not accusing you of anything, Kennedy replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. I'm just sharing some observations, like your passionate floor speech 3 months ago about the need for immediate action on water infrastructure. You told a really moving story about visiting a family whose tap water was brown and undrinkable due to aging pipes. He flipped to another page. Powerful story, really tugged at the heartstrings. The problem is that exact same story, down to the specific details about the family's kitchen and the children's health concerns, was told by a city councilman in Michigan during a town hall meeting 2 years ago. The video is still on YouTube. The host was now fully engaged, realizing she was witnessing something historic. Senator Kennedy, where is all this information coming from? This level of research is quite extensive. Kennedy's smile was different now. Not the aw-shucks grin people were used to, but something sharper. Well, ma'am, it turns out that when you've been in Washington long enough, you learn that most folks aren't really listening to what you're saying. They're listening to how you're saying it. So I figured it might be interesting to actually pay attention to the words for a change. He turned back to Crockett. See, Representative, the thing about building a political career on being the smartest person in the room is that it only works if you actually are the smartest person in the room. And the thing about social media and public speeches is that they leave a trail. A very detailed, very searchable trail. Crockett was struggling now, her usual quick wit seeming to abandon her. This is ridiculous. You're taking isolated incidents and trying to build some grand narrative of deception. Every politician makes mistakes, uses staff-prepared materials, or occasionally gets details wrong. You're absolutely right, Kennedy agreed. We all make mistakes, but patterns are different from mistakes. Let me show you what I mean. He reached for what appeared to be a timeline he had prepared. January 15th, you claim to visit a failing school that needs infrastructure repairs. The school was actually closed for renovation that entire week. February 3rd, you post about experiencing firsthand the traffic problems caused by a deteriorating highway. Your official schedule shows you were in Washington that entire day. March 12th, you share a heartbreaking story about meeting a veteran whose disability access was blocked by infrastructure problems. That veteran died 6 months before you supposedly met him. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Crockett's face was pale now, and her hands were visibly shaking. The confident legislator who had walked into the studio an hour ago was being systematically dismantled in front of a live television audience. Senator Kennedy, the host interjected, these are very serious allegations. Are you suggesting that Representative Crockett has been deliberately fabricating stories? Kennedy looked directly at the camera again, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm presenting facts and letting the American people draw their own conclusions. The question isn't whether these things happened. The documentation is pretty clear. The question is why someone would build their entire political brand on stories that don't hold up to basic fact-checking. He turned back to Crockett and his voice softened slightly, though the edge remained. Look, Representative, I understand the pressure to have compelling stories, to connect with voters, to make policy personal. But when you build your credibility on experiences that didn't happen, you're not just lying to the voters. You're undermining the trust that makes democracy work. Crockett finally found her voice, though it was strained. This is a coordinated attack, and it's exactly the kind of dirty politics that drives good people away from public service. You've obviously spent considerable time and resources trying to discredit me instead of focusing on the real issues facing our country. Kennedy's response was immediate and devastating. Actually, Representative, it took me about 6 hours of research spread over 3 weekends. The thing about truth is that it's usually pretty easy to find if you're actually looking for it. The hard part is deciding whether you care enough to look. The studio felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. 20 years of televised political debates, and the host had never seen anything quite like this systematic demolition of a colleague's credibility in real time. Crockett was trapped, her usual escape routes of deflection and counterattack blocked by Kennedy's methodical preparation and calm delivery. The man who had spent years being underestimated as a harmless storyteller was revealing himself to be something far more dangerous, a patient, thorough prosecutor who had been building his case while everyone assumed he was just another politician playing to the cameras. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Crockett sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her notes. The confident politician who had entered the debate was nowhere to be seen, replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. Kennedy, meanwhile, seemed to grow calmer with each passing moment, as if he was finally comfortable being himself after years of playing a role. The host tried to regain control of the situation. Senator Kennedy, I think our viewers would benefit from understanding your broader point here. What are you trying to accomplish with this level of scrutiny? Kennedy turned to face the camera directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that filled the entire studio. His usual Louisiana drawl was almost gone now, replaced by the clear, precise diction of someone who wanted every word to be understood. You know what? Let me talk straight to the folks watching at home. For a minute, he began. For too long, we've all been playing this game in Washington where we pretend that style matters more than substance, where we act like it's more important to sound good than to be honest, where we let people get away with things as long as they say them with enough passion. He paused, letting his words sink in. But here's the thing about democracy. It only works when we tell each other the truth. And the truth is, too many of us have been treating politics like it's some kind of performance art instead of the serious business of governing a nation. Crockett attempted to interrupt. Senator, this is exactly the kind of sanctimonious... Kennedy held up his hand, not aggressively but with a quiet authority that somehow commanded attention. Representative, with respect, I'm not done talking yet, and frankly, after what we've heard today, I think the American people deserve to hear the rest of this. He turned back to the camera and his voice grew stronger. See, I've been watching this game for a long time now, watching people who are supposed to be public servants spend more time crafting their image than studying the issues. Watching politicians who think that if they just sound sincere enough, nobody will bother to check if what they're saying is actually true. The camera crew found themselves drawn into Kennedy's words despite their professional training to remain neutral. Even the host seemed mesmerized by this transformation. And I'll admit something to you folks, Kennedy continued. I've been part of this problem. For years I played the role that people expected from me. The country lawyer, the simple storyteller, the guy who talks slow and keeps things folksy. You know why I did that? Because it was easier. Because people underestimate you when they think they've got you figured out. Because sometimes it's more convenient to let folks think you're not paying attention than to deal with the consequences of what you've actually learned. Crockett's face was flushed with anger and humiliation. This is unbelievable. You're sitting there admitting that you've been deceiving people about who you are and somehow that makes you the honest one in this conversation? Kennedy's smile returned, but it wasn't the warm, harmless grin people were used to. This smile had teeth. Representative, there's a big difference between letting people underestimate your intelligence and building your entire career on stories that never happened. I may have played dumb, but I never lied about facts. I never invented meetings that didn't occur or claimed experiences that belonged to other people. He reached for his folder one more time and Crockett visibly flinched. But since we're talking about honesty, let me share one more thing with the folks at home. Last month, Representative Crockett gave a speech about the importance of transparency in government. She said that politicians who hide their true intentions from voters are a threat to democracy itself. Kennedy pulled out what appeared to be a transcript. She said, and I quote, "The American people have a right to know who their representatives really are, what they really believe, and what they're really fighting for. Any politician who presents a false image to get votes is betraying the trust that makes our system work." The irony hung in the air like smoke. Crockett's own words, delivered with typical passion just weeks ago, now seemed to condemn everything that had been revealed about her approach to public service. "Those are beautiful words, Representative," Kennedy said quietly. "I wonder if you still believe them." The host sensed that something fundamental was shifting in the dynamic of American politics right before her eyes. "Senator Kennedy, are you saying that this kind of performance, this role-playing, is common in Washington?" Kennedy's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, I'm saying that Washington has become a place where people spend more time working on their characters than working on character. Where politicians hire teams of writers to create authentic-sounding personal stories because they're real. Experiences aren't compelling enough. Where the goal isn't to serve the people who elected you but to manage your brand well enough to get re-elected." He gestured toward Crockett, who sat silent now, her earlier fight completely drained away. "Representative Crockett here isn't unique. She's just a very clear example of what happens when we decide that politics is about performance instead of public service. When we choose to manufacture experiences instead of learning from real ones. The studio lights seemed harsh now, exposing every detail of both politicians' faces. Crockett looked older somehow, as if the weight of her exposed deceptions had physically aged her in the span of an hour. Kennedy, on the other hand, seemed energized, as if dropping his longtime persona had freed something inside him. "Here's what really gets me," Kennedy continued, his voice growing more passionate. "While she's been busy creating fictional encounters with veterans and families and communities, there are real veterans who need help, real families struggling, with real problems, real communities that have been ignored. But those stories aren't convenient for her political narrative, so they don't matter." He leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera again. "Folks, your government is supposed to work for you, not the other way around. When your representatives spend more time crafting their image than solving your problems, when they care more about their political careers than your actual lives, the system breaks down." Crockett finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "This is character assassination, plain and simple. You've spent months planning this attack, and for what? To destroy someone who's been fighting for infrastructure investment that could save lives?" Kennedy's response was swift and final. "Representative, the only character that's been assassinated here today is the fictional one you created to win elections. The real question is whether there's anyone left underneath all those made-up stories, and whether that person has any interest in actually doing the job the voters sent you here to do." The silence that followed was deafening. 20 million Americans watching at home had just witnessed something unprecedented. The complete dismantling of a political career in real time, delivered not through scandal or corruption, but through the simple act of someone finally deciding to tell the truth about how the game was really being played. Crockett's hands were shaking now, her breathing shallow. The woman who had built her reputation on being unflappable under pressure was falling apart on live television, and everyone could see it happening. The studio felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been delivered. Crockett sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, her eyes darting between Kennedy, the host, and the cameras that were broadcasting her humiliation to millions of viewers. The confident politician who had walked in that morning was completely gone, replaced by someone who looked trapped and desperate. Her breathing became more rapid and shallow. The makeup that had looked perfect an hour ago was now slightly smudged from perspiration. Her hands, which had gestured so confidently during her opening statements, now trembled as they gripped the edge of the desk. Kennedy sat quietly, his folder closed now, watching her with what might have been pity. The transformation was complete. The folksy senator was gone, replaced by someone who had clearly been playing a much longer and more sophisticated game than anyone had imagined. The host tried to salvage what was left of the interview. "Representative Crockett, would you like to respond to Senator Kennedy's broader points about authenticity in politics?" But Crockett wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing through the implications of what had just happened. Her career, built carefully over years of crafted messaging and strategic positioning, had been dismantled in less than an hour. The stories she had told, the image she had cultivated, the trust she had built with voters, all of it was crumbling in real time. She thought about her staff watching back in her office, probably in complete shock. Her campaign manager, her communications director, all the people who had helped create the persona that was now lying in ruins on national television. She thought about the donors who had supported her based on the stories she had told, the voters who had believed in her passionate speeches about experiences that never happened. "Representative?" the host pressed gently. Crockett's head snapped up, and for a moment her eyes blazed with the anger that had been building throughout the debate. "You want me to respond?" she said, her voice rising for the first time. "You want me to sit here and validate this ambush?" She gestured wildly at Kennedy. "This man just admitted that he's been lying to the American people for years about who he really is. He's been playing some kind of character, deceiving voters about his intelligence and his intentions, and somehow I'm the one being questioned about authenticity?" Kennedy remained calm, but his voice carried steel. "Representative, there's a fundamental difference between letting people underestimate you and actively deceiving them with fabricated stories. I never invented meetings, never claimed experiences that belonged to others. Never built my reputation on lies. Lies? Crockett's voice cracked. The word hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. You've been performing an act for years, and you want to lecture me about lies. The host sensed the conversation was spiraling beyond her control. Perhaps we should take a step back and— No, Crockett interrupted, her voice growing louder. I'm done stepping back. I'm done with this ridiculous charade. She began fumbling with her microphone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the clasp. Kennedy watched her with that same calm intensity. Representative, running away from difficult questions isn't going to change what we've discussed here today. Those words hit Crockett like a physical blow. Running away? She repeated, her voice reaching a pitch that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. I'm not running away from anything. I'm refusing to participate in this circus any longer. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the studio floor. The sound echoed through the space, amplified by the sudden silence from everyone else. The camera operators instinctively adjusted their shots to follow her movement. This is what's wrong with politics today, she declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Kennedy. People like you who think that playing games and setting traps is more important than actually governing. You've turned this into some kind of twisted, political theater instead of a serious discussion about infrastructure. Kennedy's response was delivered with devastating calm. Ma'am, if anyone turned this into theater, it was the person who built their entire political career on fictional performances. The words hit their target. Crockett's face flushed deep red, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. How dare you? She whispered, then louder. How dare you sit there and judge me when you've admitted to deceiving people for years? She began yanking the microphone wire from her clothing, her movements jerky and frantic. I came here to talk about real issues that affect real people. Infrastructure that's falling apart, communities that need help, families that are struggling. But instead of having that conversation, you've turned this into some kind of personal vendetta. The host made one last attempt to maintain some semblance of control. Representative Crockett, please, let's try to have a productive discussion. About productive? Crockett laughed, but there was no humor in it. There's nothing productive about this. This is a hit job, plain and simple. You've all been part of it from the beginning. She pulled the microphone completely free and dropped it on her chair. The thud of the equipment hitting the cushion seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Kennedy finally stood as well, but his movements were measured and controlled. Representative, the only thing that's been hit here today is the truth. And the truth is that the American people deserve better than politicians who think they can build careers on stories that never happened. That was the final straw. Crockett turned toward him, her voice rising to a near shout. You want to talk about what the American people deserve? They deserve representatives who don't spend their time setting elaborate traps for their colleagues. They deserve politicians who focus on solutions instead of playing political games. She grabbed her purse and papers, shoving them together in a chaotic mess. And most of all, they deserve to know who you really are, Senator Kennedy. Because if you can lie about being some harmless country lawyer for years, what else are you lying about? Kennedy's smile returned, that same sharp expression that had replaced his folksy grin. Well now, that's the first honest question you've asked all day, and the answer is simple. I'm exactly who I've always been. I just stopped pretending to be less than that to make other people comfortable. Crockett was moving toward the exit, now her heels clicking angrily against the studio floor, but she turned back one more time, her voice carrying across the studio with raw emotion. The people of Louisiana deserve to know who you really are, she called out, her finger pointing directly at Kennedy. They sent a country lawyer to Washington, and they got— what? Some kind of calculating political operative who's been playing them for fools? Kennedy's response followed her as she reached the door. Ma'am, the people of Louisiana are a lot smarter than you think. They didn't send me here to play nice with politicians who think the truth is optional. They sent me here to do a job, and sometimes that job requires calling out people who aren't doing theirs. The studio door slammed behind Crockett with a sound that seemed to echo through the building. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Kennedy remained standing, looking at the closed door for a moment before turning back to the camera. The host sat frozen, her years of experience unable to prepare her for what had just happened. In all her time covering politics, she had never witnessed such a complete public breakdown of a political figure. Kennedy slowly returned to his seat, straightening his tie with deliberate care. When he looked at the camera, his expression was serious, but not triumphant. "Folks," he said quietly, "that right there is what happens when someone finally gets called out for treating politics like a game instead of a responsibility. I hope it never has to happen again."